This is a special two-part episode. The first part is about the spiritual rebellion that is possible in our culture if we stay reminded of our true nature as the soul. The second is a binaural beat meant to guide you toward that remembering. This audio assistance can be found on the app Insight Timer. Just search the teachers for either Keith Welsh or the Infinite Spark of Being, where you can find all sorts of binaural beats that I've created there. So thank you in advance, and on with the episode. If you are interested in exploring these topics further, learning and connecting with like-minded individuals, check out the 3 Patreon discussion groups available. Just visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com and click the participate button. I also offer a free meditation group online every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. Just go to any of my social media profiles for the link found in my link tree. There's no pressure to be on camera or to actively participate in any of these groups. Just come and listen and enjoy. Join an online spiritual community of everyday people committed to understanding the human experience more deeply through spiritual practices that we can apply to our everyday lives. Join us. Welcome to the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and in this episode, we're going to examine the interdimensional aspect of ourselves known as the soul. Often it is interchangeably referred to as the spirit. It goes by many names: spirit, life force, divine connection, whatever you call it. It is our essential self. It's a very important concept to keep at the forefront of our thinking. Why? Because, well, there's a lot of reasons why. But one is that according to Hinduism, the soul is a reflection of Brahma or of God. And in the Bible, in Genesis, when it's written that God has made man in his own image, it's not to say that God looks like us, or that rather that we would look like God, but instead it emphasizes our spiritual likeness, not the physical one. And if you would like more information on the challenges of attempting to understand spiritual concepts from a physical perspective, see episode 174 of the podcast titled The Immortal Self. Anyway, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, "You are all my parts and parcels." He goes on to discuss the super soul, the aspect of God that dwells within the human form. And similarly, in the old ancient Egyptian belief system, the soul was thought to have a multitude of aspects, such as Ka, which meant life force, and Ba, which was representative of the individual personality. And these things connected each person to a greater divine reality. Just as the super soul represents God's presence within, the Egyptians saw the Ka as a spark of the divine, linking the individual to, or linking the soul rather to, not the human body, but the soul, I guess the human body as well, to this greater cosmic order of things. So you see, with all these texts, there's a point that's being made. And that point is that we're not merely these corporeal vessels. We're not just sacks of meat. There's a greater reality that goes largely untapped by the average human being, or at least the average Westerner. Spiritual practice, though, which is what we're all interested in, is learning to inhabit this vessel and navigate three-dimensional reality, all while constantly remembering that we are inherently interdimensional beings of divine origin. Buddhism also touches on this in the teachings of anatta, which means non-self. And that reminds us that our true identity goes beyond the fixed physical self. It reminds us that as long as we're dealing in concepts, because identity itself is largely conceptual, we remain just shy of the truth. This means that as long as we are using the mind to perceive, we are just outside the ultimate reality. And that's not meant to be discouraging. That's just the nature of the game here. So why bother? Why bother with souls and all of these things? We can't prove it, so why bother? Well, the truth is, I don't know. I know why I bother, but I guess I don't know why you should. However, if you're listening to this podcast, then you're probably a lot like me, so let's entertain the question. For me personally, I've just always been drawn to it. Sure, I never felt truly at home in this body or in this kind of weird Western world, but that changed as I got older. I felt more at home in my body. I learned to love the human aspect of me more. What did stay with me from my childhood was my interest in the unseen. Everything else just seemed boring. This stuff was interesting. The spiritual path, I hate to say it because it sounds cheesy, but it calls me. That's it. I just felt called to it. I know that a lot of the time we feel called up the mountain through the pain of the human incarnation or the pain of life itself. Maybe it was the death of a loved one or divorce, whatever the case, you're on the path and you're stuck with it. I've seen so many people try to ignore what they've learned on this journey and go back out into the world and pretend it's all real, and they just end up feeling lost. You can't unknow what you learn along the path. It'll drive you crazy. Once you get that higher taste, you just want more of it. You know too much at that point, and going back out into the world, back out into life, just the way it was, it just doesn't work anymore. That's why even, when I take on these topics, sometimes I feel like I need to convince you of something. But the truth is, if you're listening, and I have to remind myself of this, then you're here for a reason. Some of you, you might be new to this journey. So, I say this to you with the intention not to convince you, but more the intention of giving you some things to consider, if you're on the fence or whatever it is. So consider this idea. This is a big one. Consciousness is not local to the body. This human form is an antenna. The brain is an antenna. It's not a generator. It's a processor of filters and gates and things like that. Practices like hatha yoga, meditation, other disciplines, they help keep the body open to receive that signal. And that's why, as unpopular as this might be, that's why keeping the body healthy and in good repair is vital to spiritual practice. I know that's unpopular. I don't know why it's unpopular. I mean, the body is a temple, that whole thing, like it's got to matter. The vessel has to matter. And I don't mean that to shame anyone, because we all come with different bodies, whatever that means, but you have got to at the very least, respect it and treat it well. So we see this non-local idea, and we see it in various accounts. Though they're anecdotal, the sheer number is overwhelming, and they can't all be crazy attention-seeking psychopaths. So many people that have likely experienced something beyond the ordinary and are just too freaked out or too shy to tell anyone, especially if you're one of those doubtful friends. Or maybe you're the one that had the experience and you're just too shy or freaked out to talk openly about it, and you can't discuss it with the people you know. Now, I can really only speak from my own experience, and in my experience, the thing that I am, is not tied to this human meat suit. I don't know how else to put it, but these experiences are beyond real. And that's just the knowing with a capital K that you come back to this weird reality with, and we can see a small example of this in a very simple thought exercise. I've done it a million times with you guys, so bear with me. But when you're sad, depressed, happy, ruminating, whatever the feeling or state may be, there's an aspect of you that's aware of the mind's activity and the sensations in the body, right? Now, that aspect, the one that's aware of the mind that's racing, for instance, is that aspect of you racing? No, it's simply noticing. When you're experiencing depression, there's an aspect that's aware of the symptoms of depression. Is that part of you depressed, or is it simply aware of the symptoms? No, it's not depressed. It's aware of the symptoms. It's pointing. So just think about that for a minute. It's a flash of awareness right before the mind begins to evaluate. At times, it's just a sliver of noticing, but with practice, it becomes a wider gap. That gap is one of those gifts of meditation. Meditation allows us to gain insight into our true nature as the witness, as the soul or the spirit, whatever you're calling it. When it comes to evidence of the non-local nature of consciousness, countless cases point to experiences that they defy our usual understanding of physical boundaries. and again, they're largely anecdotal, these accounts reveal glimpses of consciousness operating beyond the body's limits, something our ego's reality testing, that feature of the ego, it naturally keeps all of that in check. It keeps us anchored to our physical body. And that's okay. That's part of this process. It's not to be, you're not trying to kill it. You just got to learn to work with it. And the first type of anecdotal evidence comes from out-of-body experiences, or OBEs. During OBEs, individuals describe locations or events beyond their immediate surroundings, suggesting that consciousness can detach from the physical form. This phenomena, this kind of thing often occurs during near-death experiences, NDEs, there's another acronym. Many patients who have died on the operating table and were later resuscitated, they can recall events in the operating room and beyond, like what loved ones were doing in the waiting room, or even witnessing events in their own homes while they were clinically dead. Not only that, but most report similar visions or experiences with this disembodied presence. Some people encounter this phenomenon during meditation or breathwork sessions. I've experienced it myself through both meditation, breathwork, as well as listening to binaural beats and engaging in Robert Monroe, or the Monroe Institute's hemispheric synchronization, otherwise known as hemisync. And just as a side note, I've engaged with both hemisync and binaural beats as a way to train my mind to find that deep meditative state faster, and it actually worked. And if you're interested in more about that, follow me, Keith Welsh, or the Infinite Spark of Being, as a teacher on that app called Insight Timer. Also, there's going to be a part 2 to this episode that will just be one of the binaural beats called, I believe it's called Remembering the Soul, that's on Insight Timer, and I'll post that here as well as a part 2 podcast. Anyway, so this brings us to our next piece of anecdotal evidence: remote viewing. This phenomena is fascinating and often dismissed, partly due to a rather silly portrayal of the government's use of it in the movie Men Who Stare at Goats. In my opinion, this was a psyop meant to turn people off to it, and it still is successfully used by our government as well as other governments around the world. If you'd like to know more, the very first successful soldier engaged in remote viewing is a man named Joe McMoneagle. He's still alive. He was the first. He was one of one. There are scads of interviews with him explaining it in depth, including one on the Sean Ryan Show, this podcast, where I think they did a 4-hour interview, and it was very interesting stuff. In fact, Joe McMoneagle used remote viewing to locate the submarine that inspired that movie, The Hunt for Red October. So thank you, Mr. Clooney, for being such an effective mouthpiece and pawn for the powers that be. You're a true patriot, you fucking hand puppet. Trauma responses, anxiety, ruminating thinking, grief and loss, stress, these are all reoccurring patterns in the mind. They're often the result of reacting the same way over and over again. Why do we do this? Because the mind believes the past is still here, happening now, causing the nervous system to respond accordingly. What the mind perceives, the body feels. Mind transformation and restructuring, MTR, offers a pathway to release these patterns. It guides both the mind and the nervous system out of these repetitive cycles and into a lighter, freer way of being. If this resonates with you, feel free to reach out via direct message or through the contact section at theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. You don't have to live the way you've been living. Change is possible. Anyway, I digress as usual. Oh, real quick. There is a documentary called Third Eye Spies on Amazon Prime that showcases Russell Targ, who was part of this whole thing. I really encourage you to watch it. So another example would be telepathy, people sharing thoughts and emotions. You know, it's believed that we were once highly telepathic. And it was when we lived in as more nomadic people, and depending on how deep you go into human history, telepathy may have been played a bigger role in our evolution, especially in our spiritual evolution. That's something that Helena Blavatsky, Edgar Cayce, and Rudolf Steiner wrote extensively about. They had a lot to say about our history as spiritual beings. Right now, for whatever reason, we seem to be engaged in this timeline where it's become a bit of a lost art. However, I think we've all experienced it to some degree or another. You could call it pattern recognition to dismiss it if you'd like, but we have all had a spooky moment where we knew what others were thinking. Or maybe you've had an experience where you heard a voice that gave you important information. It nudged you in a direction that paid off. I don't know, but for many of us, the idea of consciousness as a non-local phenomenon feels very true. And while these experiences are largely anecdotal, as well as, my own experiences are anecdotal, the number and the detail provided by the experiencers points to a possibility that consciousness is not confined to the body. So there. And do what you want with that. But look, all of the phenomena, out-of-body experiences, telepathic connections, intuitive guidance, hint at something very profound. They point to the idea that our consciousness, our awareness isn't limited to this physical form, limited to this human experience. And if consciousness can exist beyond the body, then maybe the true essence of who we are isn't this temporary physical vessel at all. Instead, it suggests that our soul, our eternal interdimensional self, is our true identity. This soul is the core of who we are. It bridges dimensions and it connects us to a greater reality. It is our link to Brahma, to God, to the divine mind. So this concept of an eternal self is something that it spans cultures, religious systems, esoteric teachings, and cosmologies. They all point to this idea. These ancient wisdom traditions understood that it is foolish to believe or to act as if you are simply a temporary occurrence on planet Earth. The human form is temporary. It changes over time. Your vocation is temporary. Even if you stay at the same job your entire life, eventually you won't be able to continue working. And if you're fully identified with your vocation, the physical phenomena known as a human, if that's all you believe you are, then that too dies, that too ceases to exist, then this can all be very, very frightening. It can be very confusing as well. I guess one could say that by identifying with the culturally prescribed identity, they're simply being brave and accepting the inevitability of death. And while I can respect that line of thinking, and good for you if that's your perspective, it's a fucking trap. Remember last week when I mentioned how many of these concepts are offensive to the power structure? Well, by accepting what essentially amounts to a government culturally prescribed identity designed to keep you in a state of desire, grasping, and clinging, you keep the power structure in business and maintain their relevance. And by the way, this so-called spiritual silliness is very much understood by and used by those in power. This is one of those things that will become even more apparent in the next 2 years or so. They know the value of spiritual knowledge. They've been using it, and they understand that the rise of this awareness within the population is a threat to the system that keeps them satiated. It keeps them fat and happy. They know there's something real in all of this, in all of this spiritual knowledge, hidden wisdom. They've understood it forever. They've used esoteric knowledge to shape society in ways that serve their interests. They also understand that as life gets easier, our desire for comfort grows, and that pulls us into a cycle of dependency. The comforts they supply become addictive, and we need money or points to buy them. This is the treadmill that they control. They own the jobs and the products that sustain their power. And they know that if they want more, They only need to increase the treadmill's speed. And they do this by creating inflation, stirring up conflict, or even introducing some new fucking disease. And it keeps us focused on survival and consumption rather than on self-awareness or spiritual growth. This is how they keep us tied to a system of dependency and distraction. It prevents so many of us from truly awakening to the eternal self that lies beyond the material world. So let me say it again. Meditation is an act of political and social rebellion. Meditation allows us to reconnect with our essence. It creates the space needed to sense it, to feel it, to experience it. Spiritual practice teaches us and reminds us of our spiritual truth. This keeps this knowledge at the forefront of our awareness. It gives us a higher taste. And once we taste God, once we get a taste of our own divine nature, their empty calories no longer sustain us. What they offer becomes completely unappealing. We crave food rich in nutrients. We can no longer swallow what amounts to junk food for the mind. At some point, the spiritual aspirant has to pass through that liminal space, and they enter into a new world. They enter with the knowledge of the soul, learning to be in the world but not of the world. As Hanuman said to Ram, "When I forget who I am your servant. When I remember who I am you." Created in God's image, we are each part and parcel of that source. Our spiritually divine essence is the same as God's. He created us in his image. So to engage in daily spiritual practice is to be reminded daily of the truth with a capital T. Meditation opens the door while other practices serve as a reminder. As one of my teachers used to say, the bird has two wings. One wing is meditation, the other is Dharma, the study of sacred literature and knowledge. Meditation clears the channel, allowing the divine signal to flow. One of the reasons I believe this knowledge of the self or the soul is so vitally important is because it's becoming part of our greater awakening. This was the point I was trying to make last week. Having this knowledge as part of your consciousness will be incredibly important in the years to come. In fact, with what's to come, I can't imagine not having this understanding as part of my own perspective. But at some point, in our human history, the awareness of this eternal self was a given. We all knew it to be true, and we lived as if it were true. However, as society advanced through industrialization, the egregore, vocabulary word from last week, of greed took hold. The opportunity to make money expanded beyond the royal class, and those who once had nothing could suddenly attain something. On one hand, that's amazing. On the other hand, we have to ask, this is a big one. Strap in. Was society ready for that responsibility? Were the people who suddenly had access to this power prepared to wield it wisely? Industrialists realized they could influence those in lower tax brackets. This softened them with comforts, making themselves, the industrialists, increasingly relevant to this lower tax bracket. I'm really struggling not to say capitalists here because I don't want to sound like a Marxist or a socialist, but yes, we're talking about capitalism. Were we as human beings ready for the power that comes with capitalism? It's a wildly egoic pursuit, but if you're living strictly as a materialist, closer to the animal incarnation, rooted in the root chakra, then I get it. You're driven by primal fear that sustains a species. I get that. You see, this whole spiritual game, this whole thing is you live in the world, but you're not of the world. As a soul, you live in this human meat suit, which is very much of the world, but you yourself as a soul are not. You are an interdimensional consciousness manifesting here in three-dimensional reality as a hairless primate. And I point this out to show you that when your thoughts are rooted in fear, discomfort, lack, or survival, those are human thoughts, ego thoughts. And the thoughts of the conscious mind, the carnal mind. But when we experience thoughts that are fearless, positive, grounded in good intentions, those thoughts come from the divine mind. That's when you're experiencing the thoughts of the soul. The divine mind is a threat to the power structure because it's the mind of the soul. It's the mind of God. There's nothing more threatening to those who live in fear, seek power out of fear, and exploit the fear of others than a fearless individual, a free-thinking person unattached to the things that concern the fearful. Now, the conscious mind, on the other hand, is the mind of the organism that is concerned with the propagation of the species, the scared small self, those thoughts that are centered around fear and concern. That's where those come from. The trick is learning to do both, to be a soul, a spirit, part and parcel of God, and yet still play the human game, inhabit the role fully, but don't get lost in it. And of course, we all get lost throughout the day. There are moments of fear, and all the human stuff, but with a dedicated spiritual practice, finding the right trail is much easier than wandering around in the desert. Getting lost on our way up the mountain happens. I've taken so many side quests in my journey. I mean, there's a lot to get us distracted, right? There's some very interesting rabbit holes to dive down. This idea always reminds me of the old Chinese curse, may you be born in interesting times. I kind of see the spiritual path like this. If you've ever hiked in areas without marked trails, rangers stack rocks to mark the route. They're called cairns, spelled C-A-I-R-N-S. There isn't a defined path, but there are helpful markers placed by those who know. They know the way. They're the rangers. I see the spiritual path the same way. You have to keep looking for cairns. Each one leads to the next, but you have to stay alert. You could miss one. Sometimes people come along and they stack random rocks on trails, why? Who knows? Boredom, ignorance? I don't know. I find the same thing spiritually, though. You know, you'll see it in things like, and I don't mean this to be rude, but you know that thing where they hang the silk from the ceiling, like it's called acro yoga or something. And you got goat yoga and you got sound baths, and they're all fine, whatever. But you know, similarly to a randomly placed cairn by some dope wandering in the wilderness, if you follow too many of them, you can get fucking lost, man. You can end up way off course doing something that barely involves the yoga part of the word yoga, you know, despite the ever so spiritually aesthetic yet trendy sign out front of the establishment. I don't know. Speaking of, has anyone bothered to grab a copy of the Vishnu Purana since last week's episode? Just asking. No judgment, just checking. Not that you necessarily need to be reading any of these books. I'm sure that binge watching Ancient Aliens and listening to some wide-eyed ancient alien theorist declare that it's all in the Vedic literature over and over again is just as good as reading the Vedic literature. So whatever. Anyway, the point is to remember the soul. Remember you. Remember yourself, the big self. Understand that this small self, this scared, egoic self, is simply the result of the big self taking birth, manifesting into human form, and working through its curriculum, whatever that looks like. This realization, this remembrance is vital to this life and to making sense of what's to come for us culturally. Because if you don't do this work, they will fill in the gaps for you. They will tell you who you are. They will tell you what you are and what the world is. Products aren't products anymore. Your consciousness is. Your mind is being bought and sold. You are the commodity for big tech. You are what keeps the politicians relevant. Don't ever forget, everything in the multiverse consumes something to stay alive. These entities thrive on your scared human ego to sustain themselves. But if you are deeply connected to the divine mind, you will have a say in what's to come. I love you. I love you. I love you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And don't forget, there is a part 2 to this episode. It is a binaural beat. So please don't listen to it in your car. Go home and listen to it. It is a guided meditation with a audio frequency to induce a meditative state. Enjoy it, and don't forget to follow me on Insight Timer as a teacher. Bye. If you enjoyed this content and would like to support its creation, visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. There you can explore the various ways to get involved and support this work. Click the About button, read a little bit about me, and see what I have to offer you through the one-on-one sessions. Don't forget to check out the Patreon tiers, where we're building a community of everyday people with not-so-everyday interests. You'll also find the online apparel store. And as always, head over to the Participate button and join us. Together, we're growing a community of spiritual seekers just like you.